Hi. In the previous video we discussed the structure of the brain, which parts of the brain are relevant for language, and what kinds of things can go wrong in the brain and what cause do they have on our language. I'm now going to discuss these issues further with my students Inge and Marten.
So I have a question about something that seems to go wrong maybe in the brain. So what I've noticed is that I myself and many people around me make tiny errors more or less all the time. And I was wondering if this is also something that goes wrong in the brain. So if this maybe is some sort of mild aphasia or something.
Okay, good. Well, these are very good observations, both of them. First, that you observe that you make these tiny mistakes, which many people don't observe right away. So it's not, you're not really aware that you do, but you do make a lot of mistakes. You're not really aware because people tend to forget immediately that such an error has occurred. But just now I made a small mistake, right? So you also, so look back, go back a little bit in this video, you see I made a mistake there, okay? But you don't realize because you correct for it immediately. And this happens all the time. So that's a nice observation, and it's also nice to make this connection, I think, to aphasia in the sense that you might think, is this now a little kind of tiny micro aphasia problem? So it's just a very regional, very small local problem in your brain, which is also very temporal, which lasts for a very brief period, and that's why you make just a little tiny mistake, right? Just the hesitation can already be a tiny mistake. And I personally think it's not unlikely that those two things are indeed connected. What happens if you have aphasia? Well, there is some part of your brain which you cannot use anymore because of the stroke you had. Okay, so you have to find a way to work around it. Maybe you don't find a way to work around it, and in that case you have this little problem. But your brain is, of course, a very complex organ, so all the time there might be just tiny little problems somewhere in your brain which cause you to just not find a word immediately, or just not make a sentence which is completely grammatical. So all of these things can happen at this very tiny and local level indeed.
Yeah. So one of the things that I noticed is that, for example, there's these things called tongue twisters. In Dutch, and I like them because they're language games. And one of them in Dutch has, you have to say the kat krabt. So first you have a K sound and then KR. What always seems to happen is that you say the krat krabt. So the KR seems to influence the word that you say before it.
Right.
So is that,
right.
And that seems to be like a planning thing. So your brain is sort of running ahead, and then the words come behind and they are used wrong. So is that what always happens, that your future words influence the words now?
I see. Okay, that's an interesting question. So again, I don't know what to say. You're making all these great observations now.
Thanks.
So it's true. So you wanted to say kat, which means cat, and then krabt, which means
scratch.
But then, so instead of kat, you say krat, because the R is basically influencing this sound there.
Yeah.
You can indeed think, well, this is because while I'm saying cat, when I'm trying to say that word, I'm already thinking of the next word I have to say, because everything has to go so rapidly, so many things basically happen at the same time. So pronouncing one word happens at the same time as thinking already of the next word. And that's indeed a very likely hypothesis about why things happen in this way. Now, do they always go in this direction only? No, not necessarily. So you can sometimes see that two sounds really switch position. So they move, one moves here, but the other one moves there at the same time. So an example which is similar to this one example you gave, and an example I like very much for some reason, is that somebody tries to say my dear queen, and instead of that says my queer dean. So what you do is the D of dear moves to the first position of queen and becomes dean, and the que inversely goes the other way around, and dear becomes queer.
Okay.
Okay, so now we've discussed mistakes that can happen when you use your own language, like your first language. But I can imagine that I also would make mistakes if I use a second language, like we use English now.
Right.
But I was wondering, would that be the same type of mistakes in the second language?
Ah, right.
Would it be different?
Yes. Well, obviously, I mean, the kind of mistakes we were just talking about, there's no reason to think that you would not make those mistakes when you speak a different language, right? So also when you speak a different language, you're planning ahead, right? And actually, a lot of these kinds of problems find their origin in stress. So you're a bit stressed. It's not not extremely stressed maybe, but just a tiny little bit stressed, and therefore you grab for words as quickly as you can, and you just find the wrong word then, right? So I would say you make those kinds of mistakes just as well in a foreign language, and maybe even more so, right? More often. But obviously then there's also mistakes which you just make because you have this other language. You have your own native language, which is interfering, as we call it, with the English you speak.
Okay, so in my case that could be because I have Dutch as a native language. Dutch people find it difficult to say that sound in English, that I could say that, because we do have the d sound.
Right. Yeah,
That type of interference.
It's a good example. Actually, I think in this MOOC you will hear me say that every once in a while as well. So that's an example of interference of my Dutch D, or the fact that I don't have the in my native inventory of sounds on my English. So that's an influence indeed of your native language on the foreign language we're speaking now, which is English. And actually the influence can go even further. So what I find very intriguing, what I found very intriguing for a long time, is that if you take French and Russian speakers, well, French nor Russian has the, but both French and Russian have D and Z. But French speakers, when they try to say that, they tend to say that. And Russian speakers, when they try to say that, they say that. So there is some kind of influence of your native language even there. Even though you have several options at your disposition, you're going to go to one of them. And that's probably also influenced by your native language.
I was also reminded of this video clip I saw a few weeks ago, and it showed a lady who was a native speaker of English, and one day she woke up and she suddenly spoke Chinese.
Yes.
I thought, is this possible? And in the video clip it was called the foreign accent syndrome.
Yeah, okay, I'm laughing because this is wrong in so many different ways. First, is it possible? Is it possible that you are a native speaker of English, let's say, and you wake up one morning and all of a sudden you discover that you speak Chinese fluently, even though you never even taken a course, or your parents were not Chinese, you've never met a Chinese person, but now you speak Chinese fluently? It's a story you hear sometimes, so this is not the only case. So it is known, sometimes in the press you find examples of this. Let's say it is possible in theory, but it's extremely unlikely. It's possible in the sense that it is possible that if you have the egg shells and the broken egg and you throw it on the floor, all of a sudden it becomes a whole egg again. That is possible physically, but it's not very likely. And this is the same kind of thing. So what could happen is that you have some kind of hurricane in your brain, which changes every single neuron in your brain, so that now all of a sudden they are set in such a way which is similar to that of somebody who has learned Chinese as a child, right? So learning a language probably means you set all kinds of neurons in your head in a certain way, right? And then you speak that language in a certain way. Well, that could happen by accident, but it's very unlikely. Nowadays, there's also some people talk about a pill. So you could take a pill which would teach you a language. So you can take a Chinese language pill. You take it and it changes your brain in such a way that now Chinese is also part of your brain. that's maybe slightly more likely because it's technology, so maybe people can do it, but I'm afraid we're not going to live to the day that that pill is going to be invented. But there's another part to this story. This is the foreign accent syndrome story. That term is basically wrong in this case because the woman woke up and she spoke Chinese, so she spoke really a different language. Foreign accent syndrome usually applies to cases where somebody wakes up and speaks their own language but now with a foreign accent. So the woman would have woken up, English-speaking woman wakes up and speaks English with a Chinese accent. Is that possible? Well, it's slightly more likely, let's say, because certain things could happen, but it's still extremely unlikely that it's exactly the same as a Chinese accent. It would still require having to reset all these kinds of neurons in your head. What can happen, of course, is somebody wakes up, has had maybe a little stroke, and therefore some of her sounds are affected. She can no longer say a the. Even though she's a native speaker of English, she can no longer say a the, and she says the instead, just like a French person would do. So that's possible, and then maybe some people around her may listen to her and think, yes, okay, to me that sounds very Chinese, and then say, okay, you have a Chinese accent syndrome. Right?
So what happens really is that some sound changes that we really associate with the accent in the other language.
Exactly. So my neighbors, they all have been to France on a holiday. Now they hear me say that, and then they think, this must be that's really a French accent. It's a bit funny, so it must be kind of a French accent. Okay, well, I guess this concludes our discussion, and I invite you to come over to the next video in which we're going to discuss one specific topic. We're going to discuss how reading works in the brain.